Welcome, listeners, to Connect the Dots. I'm Alison Rose Levy, and I'm here with you every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm a long-standing journalist of the environment, food, health, policy, the media, and popular attitudes. Each week on Connect the Dots, we connect the dots between personal and community well-being and what's going on in our larger society and our global environment. The topic on today's show is quite relevant. Over the last decade that this podcast has been going on the Progressive Radio Network, and we're now entering our 10th year, or maybe it's our 11th year, actually. No, I think it's our 10th year. Over that time, we've talked with a lot of different experts, authors, advocates, scientists, economists, planners, poets, filmmakers, about all of the different facets of our interconnected world. And, of course, we've done a major emphasis of this program for the entire decade that it's been up, has been climate, environment, fracking, infrastructures. This is kind of home turf for us, as well as the political decisions and understandings in science to bring people to address this incredible challenge. We've reported on and covered and had, all kinds of interesting thought leaders and policymakers covering the Green New Deal on the program since the Green New Deal was first mentioned. And this is also our second show covering a new book on the Green New Deal, A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. This is a terrific book. I keep recommending it over and over on this show. It's actually a very easy read. It kind of fills in a lot of blanks and does that great job of allowing us to picture how some of these things can unfold, so that we're not just kind of stuck, at the electric car, as important as that might be, or plastic bags or other consumer choices, to really look at the larger policies, infrastructures, and investments that can happen and are proposed in, the platform of Bernie Sanders to happen to bring a Green New Deal into being. And on today's show, I have one of the co-authors of A Planet to Win with me, and he also is been editing a series for Jacobin on this exact topic, so he can really discuss this in a very 360-degree way. So I'm really delighted to welcome Daniel Aldana Cohen, who's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he directs the Socio-Spatial Climate Collaborative. His writing has also appeared in The Guardian, Nature, The Nation, Jacobin, and a whole bunch of other places. And if you think that the energy transition that we need to save our planet and, by getting ourselves off of fossil fuels is just, as simple as like one wind turbine or plugging in an electric car, you're going to enter a whole new creative and interesting world of possibility as we talk today with Daniel Aldana Cohen. Welcome to Connect the Dots.
Thank you so much for having me on, Alison. It's a pleasure.
One of the places that we've been stuck on, I think, in the environmental movement or, in advancing its ideals for a while is the idea that it's somehow incumbent on people to make individual consumer choices. And, our sense of possibility, engagement, empowerment to participate in and redirect government has been so shattered and reduced, not just in the current administration, but, I would argue for many decades, that people can't even conceive of a major shift that would make this possible. A, because it's never happened, and B, I think because of tremendous sense of political disengagement and disempowerment. So, what you're really looking at in A Planet to Win is how we could redirect and what we will be needing to redirect in order to bring about the energy transformation to a new society. What are the kind of foundational, not, the foundational technology, but the foundational systemic shifts that we need to kind of see as part of this and welcome? And then we can get on to more specifics later in the show. But, what are those that people, need to kind of get a bigger sense of scope about?
Great, thank you. That's a nice big question. I think it's helpful to just start by laying out what I think the basic concept of the Green New Deal is, and then from that, the core energy piece, if you will.
Sure.
To me, the kind of a nice way to think about what's distinctive about the Green New Deal, at least in the version of it proposed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, and others, there are three elements. One is massive public investment and coordination to ensure that we can decarbonize the economy as quickly as possible. Ideally at some point in the 2030s, if not early 2040s, but a very aggressive kind of calendar backed by public investment, public coordination, public mobilization. A second piece is this idea of a jobs guarantee, green jobs or jobs that are climate friendly for everyone. And obviously people displaced by the fossil fuel industry disappearing are going to be prime beneficiaries of this jobs guarantee. And then third is the idea of direct local investment, and in particular in Black and Brown communities, and other racialized communities and working class communities that have borne the brunt of pollution so far. So I think that already gives a sense of this. This is really fundamentally a vision of really rapid transition of the economy that is kind of in many ways built from the bottom up and that benefits workers and people who have suffered the most in this transition. So in terms of energy, then, I think the transformation of the energy system really has to follow that logic. And that, I think there are kind of two foundational pieces, to get back to your question. One of them is, of course, just getting rid of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. It's not enough just to add new clean energy. We have to get rid of the problem, and that problem is burning coal, burning oil, burning fossil gas. So we have to get rid of fossil fuels. We have to replace those fossil fuels with clean energy instead, energy like solar power, wind energy. We could think about geothermal sources of energy, in some cases hydro, but fundamentally clean renewable energy that we increasingly know about. And I think the last thing I just want to say as a way of kind of getting us started is that if we tried to replace all the fossil fuel energy that we currently produce with renewable energy, that would take a very long time, and that could also be quite wasteful. It would involve a huge amount of mining for materials for wind turbines, materials for solar panels, materials for rechargeable batteries, and we want to limit that. So one of the biggest ideas I think that we have throughout the entire book is that we want to come up with a strategy for ensuring that everybody has access to plentiful and affordable renewable energy, but also that we fundamentally reduce the amount of energy that is required to live well. That's the kind of one of the ways that this book breaks with green capitalism. We're not saying that we want to have the exact same growth model, the exact same amount of waste and all of that, but we're substituting clean energy for fossil energy. What we're saying is that we want a new kind of energy system that's more egalitarian and more fair, and where we live much lighter on the earth. And I think as we get into some of the details of that, we can flesh out concretely what that vision is.
That sounds great. Also when, I just am wondering if you could clarify. I mean, I think it's probably self-evident, but it may not be so for all listeners. When we talk about the timetable that you're discussing, how does that compare with, for example, the timetables of as far as you're aware of them, of the various candidates, for example, competing for the Democratic Party nomination? The reason I ask this is because, of course, the climate and green topic have been excluded, actually, from the conversation and about our choice of candidates. And so I think that, people famously give lip service to various things, speaking rapidly at a debate, and other people can't really, listeners, an average citizen can't unpack the interpretation of what that actually means in terms of whether we're achieving the goal or not. They're hearing hopeful language, and that's kind of all they know because the topic hasn't been unpacked. There really hasn't been, unless of course they're reading in the independent media, they may not hear a real analysis of it. So I don't want to go too long down this particular alleyway, but because of the timing of the show, I just would love to hear if you have a take on how far it has been depicted in your understanding that people are going, or whether we're having a really serious shortfall in the proposed planning.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if I remember correctly, Bernie is proposing to decarbonize, I think, electricity production in the range of by around 2030, and Warren is talking about 2035. The other candidates don't have quite so stringent a timeline. I try not to get too hung up on those numbers because at the end of the day, it's a little bit hard to know, and they are multiple years out. Warren's timeline is longer than Bernie's. They both involve building clean energy well over 5 times as quickly on an annual basis than we have been doing so far. And so a huge transition, just an absolutely huge transition. So I think we can talk about some of the contrasts between the plans, but I think part of the idea that we're trying to get at with the book is not to worry so much about the timelines that are even just 10 or 15 or 20 years out. I mean, we say that you want to have the most aggressive possible timeline because it's better to miss 2030 by a few years than to miss 2040 by a few years. But we want to kind of get onto this footing of, okay, what does it mean immediately? Not as like a number or a graph of the 2030s or 2040s. What does it mean immediately to start the transition right away? And so I think, generally speaking in climate politics, we've been ill-served by timelines that are too far out into the future and not having enough kind of concrete discussion of what we would do in the immediate years ahead.
Well, I love that. What do you see us doing? Let's say, optimally, with a Sanders presidency in 2021, or what would we need to begin doing yesterday, right now, tomorrow?
Great, that's a great question. So I think one step is we have to deal with the fossil fuel industry, and the argument that we make in the book. I co-wrote this book with 3 incredibly brilliant, co-authors. Kate Aronoff, Alyssa Battistoni, Thea Rio-Francos. And the kind of first argument that we sort of lay out in the book and in one of the chapters is we have to shut down the fossil fuel industry as it currently exists. It's not that we're going to stop using fossil fuels in 2022, but the problem is basically this. If I am a fossil fuel executive, the valuation of my company is based on my promise to burn all the reserves that my company owns. And collectively, fossil fuel companies own, and it depends on how you do the math, but somewhere between 2 and 5 times as much reserves of fossil fuels as we can safely burn without breaching all of our targets of safe warming levels, certainly breaching 2 degrees Celsius. And so what that means is that even if a fossil fuel executive becomes personally invested in this idea that we need to dramatically reduce the combustion of fossil fuels, if that executive made that corporate policy, then the shareholders would simply revolt and replace the executive. So because at the end of the day, since fossil fuel companies can only burn somewhere between a half and a fifth of their reserves, that means that their valuation on the stock market has to be cut by 50 to 80%. So there's no way that the private ownership of fossil fuels is compatible with winding down that industry. So we propose nationalizing the fossil fuel industry and then managing its decline, ensuring that we are pumping and burning less and less every year, somewhat dramatically, and that the workers in those industries have their wage rates guaranteed, their pensions guaranteed, and ultimately are moved on to other, equally good paying jobs in other fields. So step 1, you asked, is to take ownership of the fossil fuel sector, hopefully after crashing its share price, then take ownership of the fossil fuel sector and manage its decline. And then step 2 is a transformation of the whole energy system. So that involves things like rapid deployment of solar and wind. right now, building new wind farms and building new solar farms can be pretty disruptive in rural communities, which is where this actually physically takes place for the most part. People often get upset by it. We argue that you really do need to do the democratic consultation, otherwise people will revolt. So in the very short term, I think we're talking about things like increasing transmission capacity, building new power lines. In many cases, that will mean building them underground. A really rapid increase in rooftop solar, and there's all kinds of regulations we can change and financial incentives we can change. But we need to have much more rooftop solar, and that's a lot less disruptive than solar farms. We need to accelerate things like offshore wind turbine development, things like electric vehicles. So we could get into some of the nitty-gritty, but I think that's exactly the right question is like, okay, 1 year in, 2 years in, 3 years in, what are the physical changes we're going to make? And hopefully that then gets us on a pattern where we're ratcheting it up, the victories and the ambition each year. We're not going to get to 10 times more solar wind deployment next year than last year, but maybe by the second or third year, we're up to that rate.
So, I have a question because whenever I hear this, I'm imagining, all of these consumers, homeowners getting kits or people putting it atop their apartment building or independent contractors coming in and doing this, and maybe the pricing is, subsidized by the government to bring it within people's pocketbook range so that more people can do it. Is it something like that, or do you visualize it as, for example, people hired by government who are just like, kind of out on the job, and this is part of like a work progress kind of happening, or, that people then are hired into. And the reason I'm asking is, in terms of, the role of government, because I think some people are, America has been so individualistic and, my home, my job, and, and all of that, that the idea of, sort of loss of liberty or control or, who you're working for. So, I mean, is it kind of a privilege, to insist on, individual suppliers and independent contractors, or is it actually an economic practicality to do that? I'm just curious about that. As someone who lives in rural communities.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's no question that a big hurdle for the Green New Deal will be the kind of intrinsic, or let's say intuitive distrust of government that's been built up in the U.S. basically forever, and ended by the right, essentially.
Yes.
I think that when you talk about some of the smaller scale projects like you just raised, we have to imagine that this will be somewhat flexible. So we've talked, we talk in the book, we endorse this idea, and it exists in its biggest form in California. So in California, they have something called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is revenue from the state's cap and trade. And the idea, or in law in California now, approximately 1/3, 35% of the clean investments made through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund have to go directly into frontline communities. That's working class and racialized communities. So that's an idea very important to the Green New Deal and to the Green New Deal resolution introduced by AOC and Ed Markey back in February 2019. So if we are talking about, for instance, federal grants to for low-income communities, I think you can think about different possibilities. You can talk about zero-interest loans for businesses. You could talk about potentially the federal government just literally paying contractors to put solar panels on multifamily apartment buildings or on low-income homes. I think you could also think about worker co-ops as a really essential strategy for transforming the structure of the economy. And when you have federal grant programs, eventually what you're doing is you're distributing money locally that has to be spent based on certain criteria. And you could have very favorable criteria such that it essentially makes sense for local government to be hiring worker cooperatives to go and install the solar panels. So installation of solar panels, since you asked, is an interesting business. It's you have to learn some skills. It takes some work to do, but it's not like starting a solar panel installation business isn't like starting a car manufacturer. It doesn't take that level of skill or difficulty. So I think that at least in the way that I sort of see it, I'd be much more interested in fostering cooperatives and, if necessary, in certain cases, local government workforces than, let's say, literally having the federal payroll paying workers to do it. Now, there may be some cases, let's say in hard-to-reach rural agencies, where you really want to have like a small federal task force, kind of WPA style, where they go around and you put up panels where they don't fit. But at the end of the day, I think this fundamental vision of the Green New Deal is using federal funding, unlocking federal funds to support local initiatives that are creative and that are flexible based on local concerns, and that, if it makes sense to set up worker cooperatives, if there are people interested in that, it can go to that. If there's a local agency that's already working on this, it can expand. If there's already a thriving private market, then you adjust the incentives to make sure that those panels are going up on low-income homes first.
In terms of the rural populations, how are people going to, some populations may take to the idea of cooperative, but it's actually, it's kind of a relatively new idea. And as somebody who's belonged to a cooperative for over, I guess 20 years or so at this point, I can also confess that there's just, a lot of kinks in functioning cooperatively. The people are not as, skilled in, or, it's kind of outside of the value set that, many Americans have lived in. I think the younger generation is really, because of the economic blows to our economy and to, the high cost of education and all the rest of it, are basically, rapidly adapting and changing to live in a more communitarian model, and in fact are kind of modeling what that looks like for everybody. But how do you see the other generations who have been, who have come along and grown, with this individualistic, sort of single person business, single homeowner, kind of mindset, adapting?
Thanks. It's interesting to think about this. There are so many different components to it. There's definitely a big rural-urban split in how Americans perceive politics. There's also a very important regional split. If you look at public opinion, what, like, quote-unquote rural people in Appalachia, how they respond to survey questions is very different from, let's say, how they do in New England. And we could go through it. So I think we have to recognize that. There's also a very important generational split. We saw this in the UK with Corbyn, and we see it in all the polls here as well. And I work with Data for Progress, which is a polling organization. So I've been on the back end of a large number of polls. And you have, again, this urban-rural split, and you have a very substantial generational split. And I think we have to be mindful of the fact that if the Green New Deal is going to work, it has to make a really positive impact in rural parts of the country, that we can't let that cede that entire territory to the right. And electorally and politically, it'd be, of course, very dangerous to only have people under 45, supporting the Green New Deal. So is everything going to be done by cooperatives? I'm sure that it won't. Can we expect over time a major increase in cooperatives? I don't know. I think there are different forms of cooperative. There are consumer cooperatives. There are ownership cooperatives where essentially all that's asked is that you sign your name on a piece of paper and you get some economic dividend. And I know that's not necessarily bad. So in Germany, in rural Germany, you have the rise of wind power in the form of rural energy cooperatives, where neighbors shop around to each other, but it's not that every member of that cooperative is literally out working on the wind turbine. And I think about 2012, about 46% of the clean energy in Germany was produced by energy cooperatives. 20, 30 years prior, it was zero. So is it possible in the U.S. I think over time ramp up the number of cooperative structures? I think absolutely. But I think you're right that it depends, and you have sometimes a cooperative model where everybody's going to meetings every day, and in other cases you have much more indirect forms of cooperative ownership, which is maybe not so different from owning a mutual fund. The last thing I would just say quickly, and I think this is important, is we want to think about democratizing the energy system on different scales. So if you're talking about rooftop solar, then those panels can be installed by a very small business or by a cooperative. And they go basically house by house or barn by barn, and that's great. But even a small wind turbine sort of farm, a few turbines, maybe 10, 20, 30, that could be owned by a local town, a number of its members. But when you talk about offshore wind turbine developments, these are extremely capital intensive, tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars just to get started. Even very large solar arrays can potentially be quite massive. So I think we need to then start thinking about institutions like public banks or like pensions of workers, where the form of democratic participation isn't necessarily going to a meeting with 5 or 10 or 20 people in your locality, but it also simply means that you have some kind of ownership stake. And if you decide to get involved, you can. And I would add to that people often forget labor unions are a democratic institution. And so if an offshore wind if an offshore wind turbine facility is being built by union labor, and you have the kinds of labor participation on corporate boards that candidates like Bernie Sanders or even Elizabeth Warren are talking about, then you do actually have some democratic oversight of that energy project by the workers themselves. So I think we have a very, I'd almost call it like an overdetermined democracy vision, which is that everybody in a Green New Deal should have multiple pathways of having some kind of control over the energy system. And we don't want to get stuck in a somewhat old, small is beautiful left idea that democracy only obtains when it's a meeting of 35 people in a school gym or fewer or something like that. No, there are many, many, many different ways you can have cooperative ownership, cooperative control, and some of that might be pretty big scale.
Thank you. That really makes a lot of sense, and it also sounds more realistic. I mean, I think the reason why these, kind of questions that look at small fragments of the situation have to be asked is that. And that's kind of the thrust of my original question to you. This kind of big picture, multi-textured, layered thinking about our systems and where, and how they are and what needs to change and where, that needs to shift to, that needs to be restructured. We haven't really been free to ask these questions because even, people look at the political system and say it can't change. There's just been this amazing disengagement and disenfranchisement, and therefore, a kind of collapse of the possibility of even imagining some of these things. Another area which you discuss in the book, which I think is really fascinating as well, we talked about the sense of individual energy, one is in one's individual home, getting one's individual energy, and then the choices that one can make are extremely limited to what is, kind of on offer, which at this point serves the fossil fuel companies. Another angle on that is housing itself. The idea that obviously, people live in some form of dwelling that belongs to them and their family, that they reside in. But how might even how we house ourselves, move from that kind of model toward a future that is more energy friendly and perhaps more communitarian than these than this particular form of isolation?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean that's a really great question, and there are so many pieces of it. Right now, we have a housing model that definitely is way too expensive. Something like 20 million American households pay a third of their income or more in rent or mortgage payments, and another 20 million pay half of their income or more in rent or mortgage payments. So, sorry, that's out of control. We have a huge housing crisis. 500,000 people homeless on any given night, sleeping in the streets or in shelters or in other forms of non-permanent accommodation. So we have to do something about that. And at the same time, intersecting with this crisis of home affordability is a crisis of home energy affordability. About a third of Americans can't afford to pay their utility bills. That means they got a utility shutoff notice in the last several months, or they've kept their home at an unsafe temperature, or they've sacrificed on other essentials like food to pay their utility bills. So, and this is racialized. In the Mid-Atlantic, about half of black families can't afford their utility bills. So we have a huge crisis, and we have to make really big change. We talk in the book about this idea of a Green New Deal for housing, and so there are different components of this. I think one is rent control. You have to make it so that people are not kicked out of their homes and evicted and thrown on the street just because the landlord arbitrarily tries to jack up the rent. And this is important for the environment, obviously, for many reasons, but one of them is that one of the greatest causes of gentrification now in neighborhoods is environmental improvement. Actually, if you look in New York City, for instance, at most of the neighborhoods that have been major environmental justice sites, think of Harlem, Sunset Park, Williamsburg, Greenpoint, and increasingly now the South Bronx, these have been the front lines of gentrification. So community members work really hard to clean up their neighborhoods, to fight back against the corporate structures and governmental structures that have poisoned these black and brown neighborhoods. And when they finally have done this and achieved this cleanup, next thing you know, real estate prices go up, and the people who did the work ultimately have to leave. So rent control is a very important strategy for stabilizing neighborhoods and for ensuring that the people who've lived in those neighborhoods benefit as those neighborhoods get better and get cleaner. Better and cleaner to live in. There's another piece which we talk about, which is retrofitting the public housing we already have and building a new model of social housing, much more on the best Western European examples like Vienna. Really, really high quality public housing, extremely energy efficient, integrated into communities, and in many ways sort of helps us set the standard for building construction all across the private sector as well. And then another piece that links up to these other ones is this idea that we have to, yes, actually fight for density, like many urbanists now. Not everywhere. We're not saying that you can't live in rural areas, but we do want to have we want to have more density, and especially in suburbs, but that has to be affordable. Right now you have a model where essentially walkability is becoming a luxury item. So densification is really about kind of catering to the lifestyle preferences of young yuppies, young professionals, and creating kind of like consumptive playgrounds for them, but where they get to walk to work or walk around. And our vision instead is a little bit different. Our vision is that mixed income, multiracial, democratic neighborhoods, and we can increasingly have these in suburbs. And what's interesting about this vision of density we're pushing is it's actually really in tune, and you talked about this communal piece, it's really in tune with the best feminist visions of urban planning. So if you think about the architectural historian, Dolores Hayden, writing back from the 1970s onwards, in the 70s she has this great article, What Would a Non-Sexist City Be Like? And a non-sexist city is a city where people who are caring for children have access to collective care centers, to daycares that are affordable, and they can walk to those, right? So the old suburban model where the man goes into the city during the day and the mom might be isolated with her kids after school and so on, that's not good, and it's a hostile and sexist model. And density, at least a certain level of density, really is important to have that kind of thing like collective care. So you could talk about social housing complexes that have courtyards where parents can raise their children collectively, take turns watching the kids. But you can also talk about, and Dolores Hayden talks about this in other work of hers, in suburbs, it's not that you want to recreate the street life as you would do, let's say, in Greenwich Village in New York. That's not really possible. What you do is you take down the fences between backyards behind neighborhoods, and then you have kind of a courtyard between those houses. And if you imagine slightly densifying suburbs with things like granny apartments in the back, or allowing tenants in the basements, that starts to fill in the community there a little bit and allows more collective child care to occur. Maybe make it easier to find friends to go play sports with, or to meet other people that you might, sign up for a ceramics class with, or you name it. So I think you're absolutely right. Housing is at the core, is a core question when it comes to energy, when it comes to affordability of living. But we also want to change the housing system in a way that it's less about private wealth accumulation and more about having an opportunity for that community life that I think most of us yearn to have more of.
Yes, definitely. And, actually, you're right. It is about a wealth system, like everything. I mean, the healthcare system is about a wealth system. I mean, the food system is about building wealth for, toxic poisoners, who are growing commodities rather than healthy foods to feed people. I mean, it just, so much can happen when we no longer buy into and assume that there can be some kind of play there. I mean, what I'm imagining in what you're saying is some kind of combination of retrofitting new structures, expanding existing spaces. I mean, it seems like it's not just going to be like, monolithic housing complexes that you're going to be suggesting become communal, but when you're saying densifying suburban areas, for example, how would that happen? I mean, there would be building of additional structures, there'd be expansion of structures? I mean, like how would you kind of foresee that? Like, what models would be available for people to kind of begin to imagine?
Thanks. Yeah, you're right. We're not trying to do monolithic towers. And the truth is that the U.S. has been so well served, of course, by its own history, but also by not knowing enough about its own history. So in the 1930s, under the New Deal, you had, through the Public Works Administration, a model of very high-quality public housing, essentially a public option, if you will, that was not limited by income, but was meant to restructure in a way, sort of raise the level for the entire private market, and to build social housing of the very highest quality, similar to what was being done already in Europe in places like Vienna or in Frankfurt at that time. And this was very good housing, and the real estate industry was terrified of this, and they fought very hard to shut that down. So what happens in 1937 with the Housing Act is essentially the real estate industry wins, and what they win is this: a two-tier housing system. On the one hand is public housing only for poor people. So the idea was stop building public housing that anybody could access. Now it's only available to people who make 20% less than what amount would be required to reasonably get into private market housing. And along with this, very aggressive rules so that the amount that the federal government could spend per unit was so low that you really were not able to create high-quality housing. So the bottom tier of the sort of social housing or public housing model from 1937 onward is public housing as a model of last resort, which would make it economically very difficult to build, at any kind of quality. And of course, it isolates residents and makes them seem like cast-offs from society, and they're politically not very powerful constituency. And then on the other hand, you have government-subsidized mortgages for, in some cases working class, but mostly middle and upper middle class white families. And from this, you ultimately get suburban flight, and this is all wrapped up in redlining as well, which is another form of racist segregationist practices. So the kind of big defeat in the New Deal is the idea that the government will subsidize white home ownership, and it will create the worst possible public housing for black and brown families. Now, despite that handicap, there were many good public housing developments, and New York City, until recently, where it's really been neglected, has had very high-quality public housing that's reached a lot of goals. And I think often always public housing has been unjustly stigmatized. But that doesn't mean that a return to public housing is going to be a return to the U.S. 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s model. No, we want to have the social housing model from Europe, which is much more architecturally diverse, integrated into communities, mixed income, multiracial. And again, what we're doing is we're setting a standard for the entire private market. Now, you asked about a couple other things. I just want to touch on them really quickly. One, and so in terms of suburbs, I mean, you're not going to build, I think, a social housing complex, just like take it one McMansion and put in a social housing complex, in between two McMansions. We have had for years, it would be fun. We've had for years things like smart growth, new urbanism, and we've been developing ideas and understanding of how to densify suburbs. And it looks like things like changing the regulations so that anybody can build a little, extra small little unit in the backyard that a tenant could live in or an older member of the family could live in. What you really are thinking about is like putting in public transit, whether it's a bus rapid transit or let's say a streetcar or something. And around that, you're then going to densify a little bit of a commercial concentration with mixed use housing, which means that you might have commercial on the ground floor and then some units of housing for floors 3, 4, and 5. And so you kind of create essentially like main streets or little towns in the sort of central regions, and then you have a density gradient behind that. So I think there are ways of doing it really contextually, really kind of lovingly, that we want to embrace. And then the last thing I just want to say quickly is we do really want to focus on local needs. So for instance, if you take Philadelphia or Baltimore, there are vast numbers of vacant homes. And in Philadelphia, there's something like 25,000 vacant row houses. And an idea that some people are developing here, and I'm working with a primary for state Senate candidate, Nikhil Saval, who's a terrific, very brilliant, longtime labor and left neighborhood organizer. And what we're talking about is borrowing from a model in Baltimore. Why not have a campaign to retrofit those abandoned row homes and then put them into community land trusts, which means that they're owned by the community, but then families can live in them, but are not subject to the market price, right? So it's kind of like, it's not public housing in the sense that it's owned by the city. The land is owned by the community, and then the house itself may ultimately be owned by the community. It depends on the model. But people will live in them same as they would live in any other row house, but it would be affordable to get into, and it kind of stabilizes community wealth because it's long-term, essentially permanently affordable and off of the market. So it's not like we have this cookie-cutter vision where all across the country we're going to drop this like prefab Lego, vision of public housing, but place by place we're going to say, okay, what's the best way to make the housing model work better here?
Yeah, that's funny. I was down in Philadelphia, for Netroots Nation this last summer, and I was driving a friend to a different neighborhood in order to meet some people that she was meeting up with. So it took me into an area, a black neighborhood that had the kinds of houses that you're talking about. And, being a New Yorker, where, you're just constantly looking at buildings and real estate and it kind of goes with the territory. I was seeing, things that might have been the same ones you were talking about. I was like, oh my God, these are adorable. They looked like they were from the 40s or something. And then I was like, and then of course I caught myself and I was like, yeah, you're a gentrifier. Your very presence here is gentrifying. You just happen to be dropping off a friend. And then, I got out of the car because I was having, I needed to redirect myself to get out of, to drive back where I was going. And the moment I got out of a car, there was a guy in the street who was talking on the phone, and he was like, there's a white lady here in the neighborhood. I was like, okay, point taken. I'll be, when this whole kind of thing happens, I'm not going to be, following that model that has been inculcated into, middle class and privileged whites and everything else. This is their neighborhood. So, it's like the idea that we can respect and honor and create, the proper environments for all, different sectors of our society that are having different kinds of needs because of different locations, different times of life. And then instead of some kind of easily replicable corporate monolith that's kind of imposed on everyone with, tremendous inequity built in, we can actually rebuild equity with the understanding, of what needs to be rebalanced historically, and make that happen, make that possible. And, and I can wind up in, the suburban neighborhood in a little, as a, approaching elderhood person, when I approach elderhood, I can be in a, hopefully a multicultural neighborhood of some kind, but not, coming in, swooping down like, we've imbibed these capitalist values. And I'm just bringing this in because there are attitudinal shifts that accompany all of the plans that you're describing, which I think a lot of those have been synthesized and integrated in younger generation people that older generation people need to become familiar with, see themselves in, shift our long-time conditioning to be able to accept and see as valuable, and also see ourselves within them. And so that's part of the translation I'm doing in talking to you, so which I think, I really appreciate. And I appreciate, the synthesis of your vision toward things that have gotten so kind of rigidified and stuck till they no longer work for, so many people, the majority of people. So, thank you for all this work, and I hope you don't mind the digression. But when you said Philly neighborhoods, I was like, I just saw them immediately in my mind's eye, and they're adorable. They're wonderful. The idea of families being able to stay in their neighborhoods and being economically supported to do that. In a society that really has plenty, but where it is inequitably shared, we should be, with shifting that sharing, we should be redressing a lot of things and really supporting a lot of people that aren't currently supported by the current system, which is another, that's kind of the economic foundation of what you're talking about.
That's absolutely right. And, there are many. The problem with the market system is that it's just not rational, and it creates all these forms of emotional anxiety, but real anxiety, because like you were saying, if a white homeowner shows up in a low income black neighborhood and buys a home, that's not just now I have a new neighbor, which I think at the end of the day, fine, great, who cares? It could be good, it could be bad, depends on the person. But it's the threat that suddenly the neighborhood is going to change, and there's going to be more and more white homeowners and gentrification, and people are going to get priced out. So the savagery of the market is something that we have to just acknowledge is a real big problem. And I think that although people distrust, let's say, the idea of a government takeover of everything, and we're not proposing that, but people have a lot of anxieties about what's coming next. At the same time, I think they understand all the different ways in which the current system is really not working at all, except for a very small number of people. And I think that over time, just as you were saying, that really has created an opening, and especially among young people who aren't even able to access the benefits of the market system for the most part. I think they're very eager to try something new.
Yeah. This is, we verge into it a little, but as a progressive journalist and also as someone who's older, I see both the resistance to the new ideas, which I am trying to constantly inform older people or, 50s up people about. And I can see resistance both due to just cultural mindsets that have been lived within for so long that they can't even be conceived to be different, and they're constantly reinforced, that they can't change. I mean, that's like the hardening and the rigidifying that occurs, unfortunately, maybe not in all societies, but certainly in this one, as people age. At the same time, I can see that part of that is the need for security and to know that you have what you have. And so you have people, for example, voting for Joe Biden, and other candidates for that reason, because, they also, in their own and different ways, have had, and many quite directly have had limited opportunities, because of capitalism. And so they're clinging, to whatever they have, and really then engineered to be an opposite, a resistant force to the changes that could benefit everybody. So that's one of the reasons why in these conversations I'm always asking about how can the benefits be diversified, across the population, even with the understanding that, white people, many segments of white society have had better opportunities, but many have not, so that everyone can see themselves in the mirror. And I think one of the reasons, of the Green New Deal and what's being proposed, and that, not only seeing it in terms of this is actually an imperative for the continuation of the human race and for the lives of the children we have engendered, right? I mean, I can basically personally embrace it on that basis alone. But in terms of enlisting more people, I see, these I want people need to see themselves, as a problem in these social changes, just the way, we've had a situation where women want to see a female, some women feel that it must be a female candidate so that I'm seeing myself reflected, because, people have been unseen, unvalidated, invisibilized, and disenfranchised by the society. So, I think that thing where the more people who can see themselves in the mirror of it, the better for buy-in and adoption. So I just, we have about another 7 minutes, and we're talking to one of the co-authors of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, Daniel Aldana Cohen. He's the second guest and author from this book. There are 4 co-authors, as he mentioned, and we've also had an earlier show about 2 months back with Thea Rio Francos. So listeners, you can go to the Connected Dots archives and also listen to that program. So as we're down, Daniel, to the final last few minutes, and we're talking with Daniel Aldana Cohen, and he's been really cluing us in on the built environment and energy transition. Is there any key feature of what we've been talking talking about that, that we kind of missed mentioning that you'd like to, just discuss in the final minutes of the show?
Sure, thank you. I think that a couple of things, I'd really love listeners to take away. One of them is that there is this vision here of an integrated transformation of the built environment that makes it possible to improve most people's lives, to really radically reduce inequalities, while at the same time using less physical stuff and less energy. So when we talk about the built environment in the book, we talk about creating an energy system with a kind of national grid that's moving wind power and sun power, hydropower, geothermal power around the country. So when the sun is shining, let's say, on the coast or in California, that energy can move its way to the inside of the country. When the winds are blowing in the Midwest, that can power cell phones and power electric buses, in Philadelphia, as well as in Minnesota and so on. So we then talk about housing, because housing, of course, is so important. It's where we live. It's also 1/6 of the energy. We talk about public transportation because we need to move to models of public transit that are more responsive, that are more nimble, that are more flexible, and that have enough investment to really get the private car out of the picture. It's not that we think there will not be any private cars. There will be electric cars, and in rural areas especially, there will be electric cars. We hope also electric, pickup trucks, and that technology is right around the corner. And then finally, we talk about public recreation. So the New Deal actually invested a huge amount of money. One of the biggest line items in the New Deal was investing in public recreation. Many cities doubled the number of parks that they had, or tripled the number of parks that they had. Parks, swimming pools, hiking trails. In Philadelphia, we have a giant park called the Wissahickon, which is full of little cabins with WPA, Works Progress Administration, stamped onto the bricks. And the idea here is that we kind of have to create a new physical landscape that all of us live on, where it is possible to not need as much crap, as many end tables, as many lamps, as many chips by private car, where it is physically possible to live very well in proximity, close to our neighbors, close to our loved ones, close to our jobs, close to services, whether it's school, childcare, hospital, you name it. And from that, make it possible to actually visualize what does it mean to live a kind of, low carbon and good life. And, we want folks to think about what would it be like to, let's say, be 35 years old, working in a museum, with a public job that you're, friends of yours that you went to college with, working in solar panel factories, maybe running a restaurant that uses relatively local organic food. Somebody else might be designing super low energy social housing. People that who went to trade school might be doing things like helping swap out all the gas stoves and replacing them with induction electric stoves. Other friends might be full-time artists, might be musicians. Others might be running, social services at sports facilities that people in the neighborhood can go to, or art classes that a whole multi-generational spectrum of people, again, from the neighborhood can attend and have fun at. So it's not just that we're talking about decarbonizing the energy system, but physically constructing a world where we live in a more communally satisfying way, where everybody is able to find an outlet for their talents and their ambitions, and where there is, genuine collective public support for this idea that you can live well in accordance with, with your dreams, and that people aren't being left behind and their capacities aren't being wasted. And this isn't a 100-year off utopia. It's not a 200-year off utopia. This is something that in the next few years we can start to build. It's not just compatible with decarbonizing the economy, but in many ways it's essential to decarbonizing the economy, because you're using less and less stuff, and instead we're living and building something different together. Less, energy, high energy in the sense of high psychic energy, but low energy in the sense of not using so many materials from the earth.
Well, actually, I think that some of that consumption is really a compensation for the loss of community, for the loss of the natural village, with all of the different people connecting and having a way to interact.
That's right. I think it's also it's an economic strategy. We have to remember, of the elite. No one in the 1970s was marching for cheaper T-shirts. In the last 40 years, wages are basically stagnant, and the physical consumption of things like clothing and furniture has more than doubled. What you've had is the U.S. political economy has replaced the union card with the credit card, and there's been a huge incentive and push on people to consume. Even so, the main thing that people go bankrupt over are things like student debt, medical debt, so it's not, or housing debt. It's not that, I think, the point we're trying to make is not that people shop so much at IKEA that it is the cause of all of our problems, but it is there is a certain amount of our problems that are there. And so if we replace the kind of credit card model with financial security, economic security, housing security, then yeah, like you were saying, I think we have a different psychic relationship to our physical stuff and the opportunity to really focus much more on relationships between people.
Yeah, bravo. I think that's fantastic. That does sound like a realizable utopia. Thank you so much, Daniel Aldana Cohen, for being with us today on Connect the Dots and sharing your exciting vision and kind of coloring in a number of the details. Every time you talk, I see that book, that cartoon book that Molly Crabapple and AOC collaborated on, where this whole new world is kind of drawn out. So, thank you for filling in so many different pictures in that world verbally here on Connect the Dots today. So it's been great having you here. Good luck with the book. Listeners, please do get A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, because it really spells out so much. So instead of not just, being there with this phrase, Green New Deal, and then we hashtag it, there's actually a lot more depth and color and complexity and vision for a future embedded in this book, which is published by Verso, and it has a foreword by Naomi Klein. So I hope a lot of people will look at it and read it. If you've enjoyed this interview, and I think I've enjoyed it, it's been fabulous with Daniel Aldana Cohen, please share this issue of Connect the Dots with your friends. It'll be available in archives after this live broadcast for you to share and listen to. And, thank you so much, Daniel, for being with us today. It's been great having you.
Thanks so much for having me on, Alison. It's been a real pleasure. Lots of fun talking about what we can all get done.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, listeners, and we'll be back with our next edition of Connect the Dots next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm Alison Rose Levy. Be well. Well.